So here we're going to take a look at the introduction to the animal kingdom. We're not going to be studying any animals specifically in this. We're going to look at how all animals get formed, the characteristics that they share, and then we're going to go deeper into the characteristic of life for evolution and how that pertains to animals. All animals in the animal kingdom are heterotrophic. That means that they have to eat other organisms. You can't just make your own food. And I know what you're thinking, Miss Saxon, I can go home and make myself a turkey sandwich anytime I want. But while you're making yourself that sandwich, making yourself that food, you're actually consuming other organisms. For instance, you're having turkey, and that's an animal. You're having bread, which comes from wheat, which is a plant. And maybe you put a little mustard on there to make it extra delicious. And that mustard comes from a mustard seed, which is also a plant. So you're actually consuming other organisms no matter what you eat. Organisms that are not heterotrophic, that can make their own food, literally stand outside in the sun and go, ooh, look at me, I'm making food. No human or other animal can stand outside in the sun and say, ooh, I'm all full up of food now. All animals are also eukaryotic. That means that they have a complex cell structure, and their cells are going to include multiple different organelles, including a nucleus. All animals are multicellular. They're composed of more than one cell. Now, there are eukaryotic organisms that are unicellular, but they're not animals. They're going to be like protists. Also, all animals lack cell walls. Remember, the outer boundary in a plant is going to be a cell wall, but the outer boundary for all animal cells is the cell membrane. The animal kingdom is the most diverse kingdom in appearance, because I like to think I look nothing like a sea sponge, which makes us pretty diverse. Each phylum has its own typical body plan or arrangement, and we'll talk about that as we go phylum by phylum. One of the big things you want to remember, though, is that 95% of all the animals that exist are invertebrates. They don't have a backbone. So when you came up with your list of animals earlier in this semester, you probably came up with a long list of animals, and most of them were probably vertebrates, but they only make up 5% of the animals that exist. Because the animal kingdom is so diverse, it takes several different branches of science to study it. For instance, zoology is a branch of biology, but within zoology, there's ornithology, where we study birds. There's malacology, which is mollusk study. There's entomology, which is insect study. There's herpetology, they study reptiles and amphibians. There's mammalogy, they study mammals. And this list can go on and on and on. For instance, I had a college professor who studied the vision of a very specific species of shrimp. So while these categories listed here are very broad, within those broad categories we can get more and more specific. And so the animal kingdom being so diverse leads to a lot of different branches of science that are studying it. Okay, so we're going to talk about the birds and the bees here for a few minutes. We're going to look at the early development of all animals. In order to produce an animal, a sperm must fuse with an egg. This fertilized egg is called a zygote. You should have learned that in biology. A zygote is going to undergo rapid mitosis. Remember, mitosis is cell division, creating exact copies of that fertilized zygote. The zygote grows in number of cells, but the size of it isn't going to change. This rapid cell division is known as cleavage, and I don't mean like lady cleavage. I mean like we're cleaving the cells in half to make more. At the end of cleavage, we're left with a big ball of cells, and we call that ball of cells the morula. The cells then rearrange themselves, and in doing so, they create a hollow cavity inside, and we call this the blastula. Keep in mind that all of this is happening in humans while the zygote's moving down the fallopian tube. So all of these stages, cleavage leading to a morula, leading to a blastula, all of that happens before human implantation. Now it can happen in other animals externally or in different parts of the reproductive system, but for humans, it's happening as it's moving down the fallopian tube prior to implantation. So here we have two different diagrams that show you what it looks like from zygote to blastula. This one over here is taking a look at an artist rendering of what it looks like. So if this here is the zygote, it's the fertilized egg, it's a single cell. Then cleavage starts to happen. So in the same size, we now have 4 cells, and then we have 8 cells, and that continues until we have a big old ball of cells called the morula. And then those cells rearrange with this hollow cavity here, and we call this the blastula. Keep in mind the size of the zygote up here and the size of the blastula here is identical. Now over here on the right, we have a diagram of what this is, and these are real cells from frog eggs. So in A, we have the fertilized zygote, then we have the 2-cell stage, then we have the 4-cell stage. We then start to rearrange them. So by the time we get here, we have the blastula. We can see that hollow cavity right there in the center. There's also a link to a video down here. Feel free to check it out. That takes a look at how these cells divide. It's an animation basically of what you're seeing in this diagram here on the right. As the blastula starts to rearrange itself, it creates layers of cells known as germ layers. And the 3 germ layers are the ectoderm, the endoderm, and the mesoderm. And you can see over here we have a key of what we're seeing in the diagram here. Now, depending on the organism, for instance, if we're looking at C. elegans, which is a nematode, which remember from looking at the phylum, that nematodes are worms. Scientists have gotten to the point where we can take a look at one particular cell and we can identify what that cell is going to be in the full-grown adult version. We've gotten that much information on where these cells are going to end up in the adult. We haven't gotten to that point in humans, but I guess when we get to that point, it's going to be super important for then using stem cells moving forward to replace organs and things like that, because the codes of what's turning on and off, so let's say this cell here became a skin cell, it's going to give us clues about what genes are turning on and what genes are turning off to make it a skin cell. So we could then use this information to have stem cells fix problems for us down the line. So the rearrangement of the blastula to create the germ layers left us with 3 layers, the ectoderm, endoderm, and mesoderm. The ectoderm is the outer layer of cells in the embryo. This will later form the structures that include the skin, the nerves, the brain. The endoderm is the innermost layer of cells in the embryo, and this is going to lead to the digestive tube, which, keep in mind, your digestive tube from your mouth to your anus, you are one long connective tube. We've named it different parts along the way, but it's just one big tube. Also, the endoderm is going to form the lungs and breathing tubes. So you have from your mouth into your lungs is just one big set of tubes. Again, we have different names for it as we go, but it's just one big network of tubes. And then finally, the layer that's sandwiched in between, that's right smack in the middle, that's the mesoderm. And this is going to form the majority of your organs. It's going to form your blood, your heart, your kidneys, your gonads, your bones, everything that's in between. So regardless of the animal, whether it's something as simple as a worm or something as big as a human, the development from the zygote to the larva when it's born is identical in all animals. It follows this cleavage, creating a morula, blastula, 3 germ layers. Once the animal is born, they then have the same basic needs. So once an animal is born, it's alive, and it must possess the characteristics that are necessary for life that we talked about before. So just to review those with you, that's made up of cells, so the smallest living thing is a cell. It has to have the ability to reproduce, whether it's sexually or asexually. There must be some sort of universal code, the DNA, which is housed inside the cell, inside the nucleus. It has to be able to grow and develop, which I think we can all admit we're bigger than we were when we were born, and we're able to reproduce. They must be able to obtain and use nutrients and energy. Remember, that encompasses digestion and movement and excretion and respiration. and all those different shuns that we talked about before. Must be able to respond to stimuli. So if a ball were coming at your face, hopefully you would duck. Maintain homeostasis, so have a stable internal environment. Remember that sweating when we're hot or shivering when we're cold. Body temperature just being one example, blood sugar being another one. And finally, must be able to evolve. And we're going to continue talking about what that means as far as the animal kingdom is concerned now. So when it comes to evolution, there are a lot of theories about how life started on Earth and how it's been sustained now that we're here on Earth. The current theory that has the largest amount of evidence to support it is natural selection, which was put forth by Darwin and Wallace. Darwin had the evidence, Wallace kind of had the idea, but Darwin had the evidence, so Darwin gets a lot of the credit. Now keep in mind that it's a theory, however, gravity is also just a theory. Because it's a theory doesn't mean that it isn't true. We have so much evidence. We have more evidence to support evolution than we do to support gravity. And yet none of us are flying off to outer space. So at this point, we're going to move forward with natural selection being the mechanism by which animals change. All right, so adaptive radiation. One of the first ideas proposed by Darwin is adaptive radiation. It's the formation of a new species from a previous ancestor as a result of adaptation to new and different habitats. So for some examples, all the bears in North America had a common ancestor, but because they spread out and they changed over time, we now have polar bears and black bears and brown bears and grizzly bears and Kodiak bears. They all shared a common ancestor back in the day, but now we have different species. So that's an example of adaptive radiation. They had that common ancestor and then they went in different directions. Most species on Earth were formed this way. And so as we talk about zoology and the different phyla, we're going to be taking a look at how they had a common ancestor to the phyla before them, or what's similar to the phylum before them, that they built off of, that they adapted from. The mechanism for adaptive radiation is natural selection. In order for natural selection to take place, 5 criteria must be met. And along with each criteria, I'm going to give you an example of how this is the case. And I'm going to use the human population to make this point. One of the criteria is that all species must show genetic variation. So when looking at the human population, with the exception of identical twins, no 2 individuals are identical in genetics. That's why even though Miss Kaiser, myself, and Miss Williams were all female science teachers, but we have genetic variation. We don't look alike, we don't talk alike, we don't act alike. The second criteria is that all species tend to overpopulate. And I think when looking at the human population, knowing that there are almost 8 billion people, we can agree that we've overpopulated. The third criteria is that there's a constant struggle for survival. Whether this is for food or for space, I think we can all agree that there are a lot of people on the planet. Most people aren't familiar with the struggle for food here in Fallston because we are fortunate enough to be able to afford food. However, it's been reported that 1 in 3 children has a struggle to find food. And there are people here in Maryland that are struggling to eat. Fortunately, most of us here at Fallston don't experience that, but there are some people that are on free and reduced meals, so they do struggle to eat. The fourth criteria is that those members of a species that are best adapted to the environment will survive. If you can't get food, you could starve to death. If you don't have proper shelter or proper access to medical treatment, you don't survive, you die. And the fifth criteria is that those surviving individuals will live longer and pass on their better adaptive traits to their offspring. So if you have survived up to this point, you make babies and those babies share those better traits to survive. So from adaptive radiation, that's a result of natural selection, we end up with new species. A species is a group of organisms that freely breed in nature and produce viable, fertile offspring. So at this point, a polar bear and a black bear could not mate anymore, but they do share that common ancestor. Because of speciation, and that's where the division of a parent species breaks off into several different daughter species. So again, with the bears, there was a common ancestor that broke off into the brown bears and the black bears and the Kodiak bears and the polar bears and all the bears of North America, because they separated enough that they created a new species. Natural selection allows for adaptations, and adaptations are characteristics of an organism that helps it survive, and by surviving, it helps it to reproduce, all of which is evolution. There are three types of adaptations. The first one is morphological, and that pertains to body structures. Examples of this are bird wings allowing them to fly, a bee stinger allowing it to defend itself, the white coat of the polar bear allowing it to camouflage and keep itself warm. The second type of adaptation is behavioral. These are the actions that organisms find themselves performing. For instance, a crab will fan water over its gills to get oxygen. Snakes can strike at an enemy to ward it off. The human eye can blink if something's coming towards it. And physiological adaptations are where there's a chemical or biochemical process involved. This is going to be when you fall down and cut yourself. There's a blood clotting reaction that has to do with homeostasis, believe it or not. There's a production of venom in a stingray. That venom is a chemical that's used for defense. Slugs secrete a slime in order to glide over surfaces. That slime is a chemical that allows it to move. These are all adaptations that allow organisms to survive. As we navigate through the different phyla of animals that we're going to be looking at, we're going to notice certain trends that take place in animal evolution. One is cell specialization, which is tied to the levels of organization. For instance, protists and bacteria are all cells, but you'll find with the animal kingdom, even the most simple animals are more than just one cell. They're more than just a couple of cells working together. They have tissues. Those tissues are used to form organs, and organs are used to form organ systems. Now, some of the most simple animals we'll look at will only have tissues, but as we take a look at the evolution of animals, we're going to see that progress from tissue to organs to organ systems. Another trend we'll see is cephalization, that there's an anterior concentration of sense organs. They have a head, that head has a brain or some sort of nervous tissue. The more complex animals have become more pronounced in their head. For instance, segmented worms, they have a head, but it's not as profound a difference from its anus as a human head is from our anus. And finally, another trend we're going to look at is segmentation. Advanced animals have body segments and specialization of tissue. Even within humans, we have a head region. We have a thoracic cavity that has our lungs and heart in it. We have an abdominal pelvic region that has a lot of our vital organs. This is how the body has been segmented. And obviously, you will see segmentation in earlier organisms. Listed here are the different phyla that we'll study this semester. We'll start with sponges because they're the most simple invertebrates, and then we'll build all the way up to vertebrates. Now, listed there are the different types of vertebrates that we could study, but we probably will only get as far as fish. You can refer back to this list as we go throughout the semester, and I hope this was helpful for you.